But good morning. Welcome to Digging Deep Bible Study. Thank you for being here today. Let's pray together. If you're ready to study God's Word, let's pray this prayer together. If you'll repeat after me. Lord Jesus, I believe in the power of your Word to change my life. Make me more like you through your Word today. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. In Jesus' name, amen. Open your Bibles to Philippians chapter 1, verse 12. Paul is in prison writing this letter, and I heard a story about some guys in prison. Actually, there was a new prisoner in the prison. Have you heard this story? And the rest of the prisoners had been in prison for a long time. So long that this guy really stood out because he was the new guy, right? But he's in there for just a little while, and all of a sudden one guy yells out, 47. And everybody in the whole place laughed. And he was like, okay, that's weird. Then somebody else a few minutes later yelled out, 75. And everybody laughed. And he was like, okay, this is strange. These people have been here too long, right? And then a few minutes later, somebody yelled, 17. Everybody laughed. And he was like, what is going on? So he turned to this guy next to him and he said, what's with the numbers and the laughing? And he said, well, you see, the rest of us have been in here so long and we've told the same jokes so many times that all we have to do is say the number and everybody laughs. He said, okay, I'm going to try it. And he waits a few minutes and he goes, 12. And it's like dead silent. And he looked at the guy, he goes, what's wrong? And he goes, I guess some people just know how to tell a joke. So, Paul is in prison. I don't know if they told jokes like that back then. But he's in prison writing this letter. Let's read and catch up with what's going on here. In verse 12, he says, he's just said a prayer for them, right? We covered the prayer in verses 9 through 11. Now he says, and I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened here. Now, what has just happened to him? He said, everything that's happened here, they already know that he's in prison. We kind of have to speculate a little bit, but we think perhaps something new has happened with his imprisonment here. We don't know, but they had heard that he was in prison, and now he says, everything that has happened to me here, and he's having to encourage them. Because the rest of that, he says, I want you to know that everything that has happened to me here has helped to spread the good news. So we have speculated that perhaps something happened. He wasn't released. Something happened to maybe he was moved, like his trial is coming up and he was moved into a different type of imprisonment. Maybe he's not in house arrest anymore. Maybe he's more like in a true prison situation. But good things are happening through what's going on, and he's trying to encourage them. Remember, this whole letter is a letter of thankfulness. He's saying thank you to the church in Philippi. It's also a letter of joy. And so he's saying, everything that's happened to me here has helped to spread the good news. And notice there in verse 12, good news is capitalized. That stood out to me. And we're going to see it like 3 more times, capitalized good news. So take note of that, but we'll get to that in a minute. Verse 13, for everyone here, including the whole palace guard, knows that I am in chains because of Christ. So whatever happened to him in verse 12, it's caused the whole palace guard to know that he's in chains for Christ. So perhaps he got to share with even more palace guard. You may have heard it preached before that he was chained to somebody in shifts. And they're probably like 6-hour shifts. And around the clock he had different guards that had to watch him. But he had a captive audience. He got to share with them and share the Lord with them. And so he says the whole palace guard knows that I'm in chains because of Christ. Verse 14, and because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here, so the church people, right? Most of the believers here in Rome have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. So his chains have caused the believers, have caused the church to increase in faith and to be bold. Notice that boldness. I've discovered a theme of boldness in the rest of this chapter as well. So we're going to see good news show up over and over again, and we're going to see boldness show up over and over again. And I think we're going to see kind of this theme of the good news being shared, hardship happening. Have you been there when things get hard? And then boldness following that. So how do we do that? And this is not a new theme for Paul. Immediately when I read that, the Spirit just sparked in me. I remembered the armor of God prayer from Ephesians chapter 6. And you may have heard that taught before. It talks about the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the boots of the gospel of peace, the helmet of salvation, the shield of faith, the sword of the Spirit. And then it says, and pray for me that I may speak boldly that which I ought to speak. So, speaking boldly was a common thing for him. And it's something he asked other people to pray for him. And I think that's what we should do. So when we memorize, like when I teach people to memorize the armor of God prayer, we say, Dear Jesus, thank you for the armor you have provided. And we go through all the pieces of the armor and we put them all on. And then we say, and teach us to pray in the Spirit on all occasions, because that's there in Ephesians chapter 6, right after the prayer. So to pray in the Spirit on all occasions, and that reminds us to pray in the Spirit. Sometimes we forget to pray in the Spirit. We just pray out of our flesh or out of our fear or out of our lack of boldness, right? Or out of our worry or something like that. But pray in the Spirit, full of faith. If you have pray in your prayer language, pray in your prayer language. And then it says, and pray that I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. If you need to look all that, that's in Ephesians chapter 6. So I thought of that immediately, that he has boldness right here. And the church gained boldness from his imprisonment. And that is a theme for him. Paul also said in Romans 1:16, if you're writing these things down, first one he gave you was the armor of God in Ephesians 6. This next one about boldness is Romans 1:16. What does that say? It said, Paul in that verse says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God that brings salvation to the Jew first and then to the Gentiles. So he was bold, not ashamed of the gospel. And then also in 2 Timothy 1:12, this is the third thing about his boldness. 2 Timothy 1:12 says, he said to Timothy, that is why I am suffering here in prison. In this book, in 2 Timothy, he's in prison also. He was in prison a lot. So he says, that is why I'm suffering in prison, because I am not ashamed of it. For I know the one in whom I trust, and I am sure that he is able to guard what I've entrusted him until the day of his return. So boldness was evident in him. Don't you want that? Don't you want the ability to be bold even when you're going through suffering? It's like Paul had the ability to flip what he was going through. Instead of being beaten down by it, he was able to flip it into faith and into boldness. And the people around him knew about it. The non-believers knew about it and the believers knew about it. And he said, be encouraged. This has served, what is the exact words? He said, this has happened to me here, back in verse 12. This has happened to me here to help spread the good news. Capital G, capital N. The good news is spread. And that's the most important thing to him. He demonstrates that. I mean, that's the whole point of the next few verses. He said the most important thing is that the good news is being shared. Listen to this, verse 15. He says, it's true that some are preaching out of jealousy and rivalry, but others preach about Christ with pure motives. They preach because they love me, for they know I've been appointed to defend the good news again. Those others do not have pure motives as they preach about Christ. They preach with selfish ambition, not sincerely, intending to make my chains more painful to me. But that doesn't matter. Whether their motives are false or genuine, the message about Christ is being preached. Either way, so I rejoice and I will continue to rejoice. That's his attitude through all of this. Verse 19, for I know that as you pray for me and the Spirit of Jesus Christ helps me, this will lead to my deliverance. I wish I had time to camp out on that verse even more. Maybe it's just something for you to pick up and dig deeper on your own. But that verse 19, if you're taking notes, write that down and maybe ask the Lord to speak to you about that later on. For I know that as you pray for me and the Spirit of Jesus Christ helps me, this will lead to my deliverance. That could teach about the power of prayer and about partnering with other people. about the faith that he had and how it takes prayer and it's a partnership. Our prayers in the Spirit of Jesus Christ. All right, verse 20. He says, "For I fully expect and hope that I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ." This is another boldness thing. So if you're highlighting the 3 times just in this chapter that he talks about boldness, after the first time of boldness, I gave you 3 other places that Paul preached. I'm trying to help your outline here. So the first thing about boldness was up there in verse 14, I believe it is. Yes. Verse 14, he says that he gained confidence the believers gained confidence and they were boldly speaking God's message without fear. That's the first time of boldness. And then I listed 3 other places where Paul talked about boldness. But there are actually 3 places in this chapter where Paul speaks about boldness. They're in verse 14, verse 20, and verse 28. In this one chapter, he speaks about boldness. So now we're in verse 20 where he's speaking about boldness. He said, "I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ. And as I have been in the past, and I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ whether I live or die." He's willing to die. That's pretty bold. He's willing to die for his faith no matter what he goes through here in prison. He's ready to die. That is boldness. Are you tracking with me with the outline? So 3 times through this passage. I expected the rest of this chapter to just talk about joy because that's what the book is about. I expected to talk about motives and preaching. I expected to talk about several different things, but I found this theme of boldness in here that I think is just as prominent. And then that theme about good news. We're coming to that still. So, we're in verse 21. "For to me, living means living for Christ, and dying is even better. But if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ. So I really don't know which is better. I'm torn between 2 desires. I long to go and be with Christ, which would be far better for me. When I was a young man, I didn't understand that, right? The older I get, I'm ready to go be with Christ, right? I mean, I think that's selfish on my part, but I'm in good company here, I guess. He said, it'd be better for me to go be with Christ. But verse 24, "But for your sakes, it is better that I continue to live. Knowing this, I'm convinced that I will remain alive so I can continue to help all of you grow and experience the joy of your faith. And when I come to you again, you will have even more reason to take pride in Christ Jesus because of what He is doing through me." So He is willing to stay in the game, stay alive, if the Lord wills it. Eventually, He does lose His life for Christ, right? But for now, He's willing to stay alive, stay in the game, so that they can take pride in Christ Jesus and what He's doing through Him. Powerful witness. Verse 27, "Above all, you must live as citizens of heaven, conducting yourselves in a manner worthy of the good news or gospel about Christ. Then whether I come and see you again or only hear about you, I will know that you are standing together with one spirit and one purpose, fighting together for the faith, which is the good news." And then verse 28. Verse 28, I believe, is the 3rd place where he talks about boldness in this chapter. So we had verse 14, we had verse 20, now we have verse 28. He's talking about boldness. Because what does it say in verse 28? He says, "Don't be intimidated in any way by your enemies. This will be a sign to them that they are going to be destroyed. But it'll be a sign to you that you're going to be saved, even by God Himself. For you have been given not only the privilege of trusting in Christ, but also the privilege of suffering for Him." We're going to talk about that in a minute. How is it a privilege to suffer for Him? When you have pancreatic cancer, right? Why is that a privilege that you get to go through cancer? We're going to talk about that in just a minute. He says it's a privilege of suffering for Him. We are in this struggle together. You have seen my struggle in the past, and you know that I am still in the midst of it. So let's go back and camp out on these last 2 verses, 29 and 30, about the privilege of suffering, all of these things. It says, I'm going to read it again. "For you've been given not only the privilege of trusting in Christ, but also the privilege of suffering for Him. We are in this struggle together. You have seen my struggle in the past, and you know that I'm still in the midst of it." So how can it be a privilege to go through suffering? I was thinking about that in the sermon. I just went to the sermon. Some of us go to the sermon after this, and some of us go to the sermon before this. Listening to the sermon, I was thinking about this, knowing I was about to teach on this, and the process of suffering. And I don't want to ruin it for anybody who hasn't seen the sermon yet, right? But she talks about suffering a little bit, especially a story at the end. She talks about suffering. And you know what I was thinking was that life is going to happen and we are going to suffer, right? We live in a fallen world. We're selfish. We live in a sinful place. Really, we live with the ability to control our environment more than ever before, right? When you look at the big scope of history, how long have we had air conditioning? I don't know. In the big scope of history, not near as long as we didn't have air conditioning, right? And we control our environment a lot, right? We have remote controls on our garage door openers. If you have enough space, you can park in your garage. If you're like me, there's not a lot of space to be able to park in the garage. We have like 6 cars in our house, and 1 car goes in the garage. That's it. But anyway, the rest of it is just full of stuff. But we can, theoretically, if you had this, you could push the button, open the door, go in the garage, shut the door, shut the world out, go in, set your alarm, set the AC, never be hot, never be cold, never have to talk to anybody, and just zone out on the TV, right? We have such controlled environments that we think we're special, and we think that we shouldn't have to suffer, and we think that the rest of the world throughout history hasn't suffered. There's going to be suffering in the world, right? A lot of us haven't had to live through war or live through think about the people who live in other parts of the world that, they didn't choose to be a refugee and get kicked out of their country. We are just so privileged that we think we shouldn't have to suffer. But anyway, my point, I didn't mean to get into all of that. My point is that we're going to suffer in this world. It's whether we suffer with Christ and in the fellowship of Him. I think we should put the focus of this on the fellowship with Him, not the focus on suffering. We can focus on suffering and make whatever we focus on becomes larger, right? That could preach about your marriage and all kinds of things, right? You focus on this one little thing and it becomes way huge and it's like too big and out of balance, right? Whatever we focus on. So if we focus on suffering, that's going to become big and it's so overwhelming. Why do I have to suffer? But we need to focus on the fellowship with Him. That's where we get the joy that he talks about in this book. That's where we get the boldness that he talks about in this book. Let's focus on the good news and not on the suffering. Let's focus on the fellowship of His suffering. And also, what you discover here is that what He's teaching them is to do it together. He talks about struggling together. He talks about fellowship. He talks about fighting together. Like in verse 27, he says fighting together. Let's go back to that. Verse 27, I think, is key to come into these last 2 verses on suffering. Verse 27, I like the New Living Translation for this passage. So if you haven't figured that out yet, I'm in the New Living Translation if you need to switch over to that one. Look at it in the New Living. In verse 27, it says, above all. I like that because he's kind of bringing this whole section to a climax here. And he says, above all, you must live as citizens of heaven. What happens when you live as a citizen of heaven? You have a different focus, right? You have a different address. If you're a citizen of heaven, you have a different address. Wow, that could get into us, right? If we thought about how my address isn't Willis, or my address isn't Conroe, or Montgomery, or Magnolia, or wherever you live, my address is in heaven, right? We live as citizens of heaven. His kingdom is going to come. His will is going to be done. We are going to live in the kingdom of heaven. But what if we started thinking that way right now? It's identification, like Pastor Randy preached. One of the ways you beat stress is identification, knowing who you are. We are citizens of heaven. If you live as citizens of heaven, conducting yourselves in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ, then whether I come and see you or hear you again, I know that you are standing together. This is the next part. The first part was citizens of heaven. The next part is standing together with one spirit and one purpose. If we did that, we could go through the suffering together. We could develop joy. We could develop boldness if we stood together with one spirit and one purpose. And then third, fighting together for the faith, which is the good news. Fighting together. See, we're going to be in a fight. It's just, how do we do it? Are we going to go on the offensive, and are we going to be strategic about it? Or are we just going to be mentally prepared in advance? Things are going to go wrong today, right? You might have a flat tire. I'm not saying that over anybody here. If anybody has a flat tire when they leave here, they're going to blame me, right? 2 days ago. Okay, we've already had that, so that's good, right? When you have a flat, was that something that you did wrong, that you had a flat tire, right? No, I remember you told me the story. Thankfully, she rolled right into her garage, and she kind of looked at it and it was completely on the concrete. I mean, she just made it right into the garage. At least she wasn't stranded on the side of the road, right? But we need to fight together, standing together with one spirit and one purpose, living as citizens of heaven. This is how we go through the privilege of suffering for Him. So now, when you have that set up, the citizens of heaven, standing together in one spirit, one purpose, fighting together, then you can read verse 29 and 30 says, "For you have been given not only the privilege of trusting in Christ, but also the privilege of suffering for Him. We are in this struggle together. You have seen my struggle in the past, and you know I am still in the midst of it." And that concludes this first chapter. Talking about suffering here, I think I have about 5 more minutes. It also reminded me, and so I kind of wanted to wrap up with this, not just talking about Paul and the fellowship of suffering, but talking about Jesus, right? We should take things back to Jesus. By the way, I didn't finish the good news. Maybe I'm out of order in my notes. Oh, I kind of am. I'm still coming to the good news part. Okay, hang on for the good news part. The good news, capital G, capital N. But I wanted to take you to Jesus next, about the fellowship of suffering with Jesus. If you're taking notes, write this down. Matthew 20, 22 and 23. Matthew 20, 22 and 23. Jesus is talking about suffering here. Jesus had just been approached by James and John's mother. She was that helicopter mom, right? That got involved and was pleading with Jesus on behalf of her boys. And she said, "Can one of them sit on your right hand and one of them on your left when you come into your kingdom?" But verse 22 says, "But Jesus answered by saying to them, 'You don't know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the bitter cup of suffering that I'm about to drink?' 'Oh, yes,' they replied, 'we are able.' Jesus told them, 'You will indeed drink from my bitter cup, but I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. My Father has prepared those places for the ones He has chosen.'" So that's what Jesus said about suffering. He said, you will go through it. But He also said, do you really know what you're asking for, right? My goodness. Jesus' answer here is not severe, but it mingles firmness with probing. It is often ignorance that seeks leadership, power, and glory. They were ignorant in seeking leadership, power, and glory the way they were doing, asking for it to be given to them. The brothers do not know what they are asking. To ask to reign with Jesus is to ask to suffer with Him. And not only do they not know what they are asking for, they have as yet no clear perceptions of Jesus' sufferings. At this point, they don't know what He's about to go through. They had seen crucifixions, right? But they didn't really get it yet, that that's what He was about to do. To ask for worldly wealth and honor is often to ask for anxiety, temptation, disappointment, and envy. And we do seek after worldly wealth and honor sometimes, don't we? We do have selfish ambition sometimes, and we seek after more money, more honor. But it brings anxiety, temptation, disappointment, and envy. And in the spiritual arena, to ask for great usefulness and reward is often to ask for great suffering. Revelation chapter 1, verse 9. It's another example of suffering. I'm trying to give you an example, not just with Paul, but with Jesus. And now, in Revelation, my example is going to be with John, the apostle. It's there in the first chapter of his book, Revelation chapter 1, verse 9. He says, I, John, am your brother and your partner in suffering, and in God's kingdom, and in the patient endurance to which Jesus calls us. He says, I was exiled to the island of Patmos for preaching the word of God and for my testimony about Jesus. So he identifies himself as their partner in suffering. So I'm trying to say today, don't be surprised if you go through the fellowship of suffering, right? Don't be surprised. But let's go through it like Paul did, as citizens of heaven, standing firm together. You can't do it by yourself. All this is plural. And then it says, fighting together with one spirit and one purpose. We've already covered all of that. But now let's wrap up with the good news. I kind of geeked out on the good news, and I just went into it. I started looking at this good news, because when something is capitalized like that, to me it's personifying Jesus, right? That's why they give it capital letters, because it's making it representative of Jesus. And actually, what I discovered, that Paul was fascinated. I said that I geeked out over this good news thing. I figured out this was his master passion. One of the people that I studied in putting this together said Paul's master passion was the gospel, or the good news. They said it showed up in his writings, in all of his books. 72 times he talks about the gospel. And I could go through several examples of that, but he's always talking about the gospel, the gospel, the gospel this, the gospel that, the gospel this, the gospel that. He talks about the gospel over and over and over again. That's what he was living his life for, was the gospel. And here in this book of Philippians, it shows up 8 times. 3 times just in this chapter that we're in right now, it shows up good news, good news, good news, and it's in capital letters. In Philippians, it says, for you have been my partners in spreading the good news about Christ. Another place it says, defending and confirming the truth of the good news. Another place it says, has happened to me here, has helped to spread the good news. Defend the good news. Conducting ourselves in a manner worthy of the good news. Fighting together for the faith, which is the good news. Preaching the good news. Telling others the good news. When I first brought you the good news and then traveled on. That's what he says at the end of the book. So he talks about the good news over and over and over again. The good news of the gospel. I probably need to just create a whole nother lesson on the good news, because he even goes through and calls it's called the gospel of God's grace, because the word gospel and good news are interchangeable. So it's called the gospel of God's grace, the gospel of salvation, the gospel of peace, the gospel that holds out hope, and the gospel that's worth dying for. So wow, if you want to dig into that some more on your own, this is digging deep. Dig into the good news or the gospel. You could start here in the book of Philippians, because it's mentioned 8 times just in this book, but then take it on from there. But I hope I've given you some things to think about. We're going to go into a time of discussion in just a minute. On Zoom, they're doing it live, and they're going to go into some discussion there on Zoom. If you're watching this later, please join us with the Zoom live. You can join us on Sunday mornings and do this live, and then have a Zoom group to discuss with. But let's pray, and we'll discuss live in this room. They'll discuss on Zoom. But let's close this part of the teaching time with prayer. Father God, we love you. Fill us with the joy that Paul had, even in the midst of suffering. Fill us with the boldness that Paul had. Give us people to fight together with, people to stand together with one purpose and one mind. Help us to spread the good news of Jesus Christ and what that means. Fill us with the joy of that. Make this real to us, reveal to us. Bless this time of discussion now, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.